37 people watched her bleed. Not one of them moved. A 19-year-old girl tied to a wagon wheel in the town square, wrists cut to the bone by hemp rope, 6 hours under the July sun, because she said no to a marriage proposal. The sheriff saw her and walked into the saloon. The carpenter took half a step forward, and his wife yanked him back, and her own father stood 30 feet away on the dry goods porch, hands shaking, a tin cup of water in his grip. And he could not cross the distance between them. Then hoofbeats. From the south road, slow and steady. A stranger rode in with no hat, a scar the length of a forearm across his back, and a knife on his belt. He looked at her, the only person in the whole town who would, and he started cutting rope. But this man has his own nightmare. 2 graves under an elm tree back in Missouri. A wife who died calling his name while he sat in a saloon 3 miles away, and a guilt so heavy he built a cabin with 2 dents in the wall, fist-shaped, at head height. She has a secret too. Her mother didn't die of pneumonia. She was murdered, and the proof is hidden under a church pew in a dead man's ledger. This is Wild West Stories Channel, where we bring you tales of courage, heartbreak, and love born from the dust and grit of the American frontier. If your heart beats for the Old West, you found your home. This is a story about what happens when the people meant to protect you become the ones you need protecting from, and the strangers who show up with nothing but a knife and the courage to cut you free. It teaches us that healing doesn't come from forgetting what broke you. It comes from picking up a hammer and building something new with the same hands that once bled. Before we begin, if stories like this hit you right in the chest, do me a favor. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a new tale from the frontier. Leave a comment and tell me, who in this story do you relate to most? And if someone in your life needs to hear that it's never too late to start rebuilding, share this with them. Now settle in. This one's going to leave a mark.
Clara Dawson had counted 37 people watching her bleed, and not one of them had moved. Not the women clutching their children close. Not the men with their thumbs hooked in their belts. Not the old widow standing at the edge of the crowd, gripping her own wrist, like she could feel phantom ropes tightening. And not the man on the dry goods porch who had cried the day he first held her, 19 years ago, in a room that smelled like iron and new life. Her father stood 30 feet away with a tin cup in his hand, and he did not move. The hemp bit into her wrist bones every time she drew breath. 6 hours now, or close to it. The July sun had crossed the sky from the livery roof to the bell tower, dragging its heat across the packed dirt of Elk Crossing's town square like a branding iron pressed slow against hide. Clara felt every degree of it. The sweat rolling down her arms found the rope burns and turned to fire, salt in raw flesh. The specific, clarifying pain of a body reminding itself that it was still alive even when everything else suggested it should not be. The white dress clung to her back, translucent with sweat. Her mother had sewn it. Miriam Dawson, dead 4 years now, had sat by the lamp every night for 3 months, pushing a needle through cotton until her fingers bled, because she wanted her daughter to feel beautiful on the day she chose somebody. Chose. That was the word her mother used, not the word Elk Crossing used. Edna Whitmore came to check the ropes. She moved through the crowd the way a hen moves through a yard, purposeful and clucking, her Sunday bonnet crisp despite the heat. She stopped behind Clara and tugged the knot against the wagon spoke. Her hands trembled, just barely, just enough that Clara felt the vibration travel through the rope and into her bones. Edna leaned close. Her breath was hot against Clara's ear and smelled like mint tea and something sour underneath. "My boy is waiting at the church. Nod your head and this ends." Clara did not nod. She did not speak. She had not spoken once in 6 hours, and the silence had become its own kind of weapon, the only one they had left her. Edna tucked a strand of Clara's hair behind her ear. The gesture was almost maternal, almost gentle, and that was what made it terrible, because tenderness from the woman who had ordered this was worse than any slap. It meant Edna believed she was helping. It meant she would do it again. Clara stared at the sun until her eyes streamed. A memory surfaced, 3 weeks old and sharp as broken glass. Silas in the barn, his hand around her wrist. Not squeezing, just holding the way a man holds something he has already decided belongs to him. His voice calm, almost bored. "You do not have to like me, Clara. You just have to say yes." She had pulled free. He had let her go. But he smiled, and the smile was worse than if he had hit her. A smile that said, "This is not over, and we both know it." She had told her father that night. Harlan Dawson sat at the kitchen table with a bottle in his hand, and his eyes focused on a point 6 inches behind reality. "The Whitmore family has done right by this town, Clara. Do not make trouble where there is none." Now Harlan stood on the dry goods porch with that same distant stare. Except today the distance was not whiskey. Today it was something else. His hand lifted toward the porch steps and fell back. His fingers were white on the tin cup. Water sloshed over the rim because his hands would not stop shaking, and it was not the drink this time. He kept pulling his hat brim lower, hiding his eyes from the square, from his daughter, from the 37 people who could see him choosing nothing. He was not indifferent. He was paralyzed. But paralysis and indifference look exactly the same to the girl bleeding 30 feet away. The crowd was not silent. It murmured. A child tugged her mother's sleeve. "Why is Miss Clara tied up?" The mother shushed her and pulled her close. Tom Bridger, the carpenter, took half a step forward. His wife grabbed his sleeve and yanked him back. Old Pete Fryer leaned on his cane beside Harlan and said something low. Harlan did not respond. Pete shook his head and limped away. He did not look at Clara either. Sheriff Tom Reading crossed the square. He looked directly at Clara. His eyes met hers for 1 full second, long enough for her to see something in them that might have been shame or might have been calculation. Then he turned and walked into the saloon. The door swung shut behind him. Clara's vision blurred. Not tears. Dehydration. 6 hours without water in July heat. Her tongue was thick and cracked and tasted like copper from where she had bitten through her own lip to keep from screaming when Edna first pulled the knots tight. She stared at the sun again. Easier to look at than her father. Then hoofbeats. From the south road. Slow and steady, the rhythm of a horse that was not being pushed. A boy on a barrel near the livery pointed. Somebody is coming. The crowd shifted. Heads turned. Clara opened her eyes. A rider moved through the heat shimmer at the edge of town, leading a pack horse behind him. He wore no hat, which was strange for July. His hair was dark, pushed back from a face burned brown by sun and years. His shirt was plain, sleeves rolled to the elbows. Across his left shoulder blade, visible where the cotton pulled tight, ran a scar the length of a man's forearm. He did not look at the crowd. He did not look at the storefronts or the saloon or the bell tower. He looked at Clara. The stranger dismounted, and the first thing Clara noticed was not the knife on his belt or the scar pulling tight across his shoulder. It was that he was looking directly at her while every other soul in Elk Crossing was trying to look anywhere else. Josiah Kane had promised himself he would not stop in another town. The promise lasted 11 seconds. That was the time between seeing the girl tied to the wagon and reaching for his knife. He had been riding since before dawn. 40 acres of federal homestead land waited for him on Broken Ridge, past the creek where the water ran cold over smooth stones. He had filed the claim 2 months ago in Cheyenne, paid the fee, signed the paper, built a cabin that was 4 walls, a roof, and nothing else. No curtains, no pictures, no reason to stay except that a man had to stop running eventually, and Josiah Kane had been running for 3 years. Missouri to Kansas, to Colorado, to Cheyenne, to here. Each place lasting only as long as it took for the quiet to become unbearable, for the empty cabin to start sounding like another empty cabin, The one in Missouri with the elm tree in the yard where he had dug two graves side by side with his own hands. Margaret and Samuel, his wife and his son. Typhus took them both in the same week while Josiah was 3 miles away in a saloon arguing about the price of rye whiskey. He did not think about that now. He could not think about that now. Because there was a girl tied to a wagon wheel in the center of a town square, bleeding from both wrists. And something inside Josiah Kane that he thought had died under that elm tree lurched upright like a man startled from sleep. He dismounted, looped the reins over the hitching post, took a long drink from his canteen because his hands needed something to do before they did something reckless. Then he walked into the center of town. The girl watched him come. Her eyes were dark and hard and dry. No tears. 6 hours of bleeding in the sun, and she had not cried. That hit him somewhere he did not expect. In his mind, a flash, one sentence long. Margaret on the bed, arm reaching toward the door, calling his name while he sat in a saloon 3 miles away. He blinked it gone. He stopped 6 feet from the wagon and looked at the ropes, looked at the blood-dried brown on her forearms, looked at the white dress ruined with dust and sweat and shame. He pulled the knife from his belt. Not fast, not threatening, just certain. Now hold on. Sheriff Redding pushed back through the saloon doors, hand on his holster. You cannot just ride into town and start cutting. Josiah did not look up. He knelt beside the wagon wheel and set the blade against the first rope. I said, hold on, mister. This girl has been sentenced by the community. Josiah spoke without turning. His voice was low and flat, and carried the particular boredom of a man reciting something he had memorized long ago. Federal Homestead Statute, Section 12. Territorial Assault Code, Section 8. Unlawful detention on public land without a warrant signed by a territorial judge. He paused. You have a judge here, Sheriff? A courtroom? A written law that says you can rope a woman to a wagon for turning down a marriage proposal? Reading's mouth worked. No sound came out. That is what I figured. Josiah cut the first rope. Clara's left arm dropped and she gasped. Not a scream. A sound pulled from deep in the chest, the sound of blood flooding back into muscles that had been locked too long. Reading's hand tightened on his holster. Mister, I am warning you. You are warning me. Josiah cut the second rope. And this girl is bleeding. Clara fell. She did not stagger into his arms. Her legs gave out and she went down hard in the dirt, knees hitting packed earth, palms slapping ground. Josiah stepped back. One full step. He placed the canteen on the ground beside her, within reach, but not in her space. You are safe now. 2 words. He meant them. But even as he said them, he knew they were more for the ghost in his head than for the girl in the dirt. Clara pushed herself up on shaking arms. She looked at him for the first time. Studied him the way a person studies a snake before deciding whether it is the killing kind. What do you want? Nothing. She did not believe him. He could see it in her eyes. 19 years of living had taught her that men always wanted something. Behind them, the crowd murmured. Edna Whitmore turned and walked fast toward the saloon. The back of her dress was soaked through with sweat. She was afraid, too, but she feared her son more than she feared God. Josiah reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out a folded document. He held it toward the sheriff. Federal land grant, homestead claim on Broken Ridge, 40 acres past the creek. My name is Josiah Kane, and I am a property-holding citizen of this territory. Reading took the paper. Read it. Read it again. Josiah turned to Clara. She was on her feet now, swaying, both hands pressed against the wagon wheel for balance. Her wrists left blood prints on the wood. I have a cabin on Broken Ridge, he said. You can come there or you can go anywhere else. If you would rather ride alone, take the horse. I will walk. He meant it. She could see that he meant it. And the fact that he was willing to give her his horse and walk 20 miles in July heat was the only reason she did not turn away. Clara looked toward the dry goods porch one last time. Harlan had stood up. He was coming down the steps. 1 step, 2. He reached the last step and stopped. His boot hovered over the ground, shaking, and then settled back on the wood. 1 stare. That was the distance between father and daughter. Harlan Dawson could not cross it. Clara turned away. She followed the stranger, not because she trusted him, because there was nowhere else. They were half a mile out when he heard her voice behind him, raw and cracked from 6 hours without water. "If you lied about the door that locks from the inside, I will take that knife of yours and use it." Josiah did not turn around. "Knife is on the left side of the saddle. Take it and keep it." She did. The cabin was one room, and the first thing Clara saw was not the bed or the stove. It was two dents in the wall at head height, the wood splintered in a pattern that could only come from a man hitting it over and over until either his fist or the wall decided to give. She stood in the doorway and stared at those dents, while the last of the daylight fell across the pine floor in long gold strips. Behind her, Josiah unsaddled the horses in the yard. He had not followed her inside. He had pointed to the door and said, "Latch works from the inside. I will sleep on the porch." Then he walked away. Clara latched the door. She pressed her back against it and slid to the floor and sat there for a long time, listening to her own breathing, feeling the cool of the wood through the ruined dress. The cabin smelled like pine sap and coffee and something faintly metallic like a tool left in rain. It was clean, swept. The cot in the corner had a wool blanket folded tight at the foot. The cook stove still held warmth from the morning. A table with two chairs, though only one showed where. A shelf on the far wall held three things: a tintype photograph of a dark-haired woman holding an infant, both of them looking at the camera with the quiet trust of people who believed the man behind it would keep them safe. And beside the photograph, a small carved wooden horse, sized to fit in a child's palm. Clara did not touch either one. She did not need to. She understood. This man was not building a home. He was building a foxhole, a place to survive, not to live. She slept, not on purpose. Her body simply stopped. 14 hours she slept, dreamless and deep, the kind of sleep that comes after the body has burned through every reserve it has, and there is nothing left but surrender. When she woke, the light had changed. Morning. Her wrists had been wrapped in clean cloth. She could feel the difference. The old bandages, the ones Josiah had applied on the trail, were gone. New cloth, tighter, more careful. A tin of salve sat on the edge of the cot within reach. He had wrapped her wrists while she slept, but the salve was beside the bed, not on her skin. He had changed the bandages but would not apply the medicine. That was her choice. Clara sat up slowly. Every muscle ached. Her shoulders felt like they had been pulled from the sockets and shoved back in wrong. Her wrists throbbed with each heartbeat, and when she unwound the wrappings to look, the wounds were ugly. Raw red grooves circling both wrists, some crusted, some still weeping. She applied the salve herself. It stung. She welcomed the sting because it meant her nerves still worked, her hands still worked. She still worked. Outside, the sound of an axe splitting wood, steady rhythm, no wasted motion. Clara opened the door. Josiah was at the chopping block 20 feet from the porch. His shirt was already dark with sweat. The scar on his shoulder blade pulled tight every time he raised the axe. He did not look up when she came out, but he spoke. "Coffee is on the stove. Bread is on the table." She noticed his habits that first morning. He did not sit with his back to a door. He positioned himself where he could see the trail and the tree line and both sides of the clearing. When she dropped a tin plate while pouring coffee, Josiah was on his feet with his hand on his belt before his eyes were fully open. Then he caught himself, let his hand fall, sat back down. War, Clara thought. Not all scars show on skin. She drank the coffee standing up, ate bread standing up. She ate fast the way people eat when they have learned that food can be taken. Josiah came in for water. He glanced at her wrists. His voice shifted to something clipped and practical, the voice of a man who had treated wounds before and learned to separate the treating from the feeling. "You will need to clean those twice a day. Infection out here kills faster than bullets." He showed her the salve, showed her how to wrap the cloth, firm enough to hold but loose enough to let the skin breathe. When he examined the wounds, his hands were steady, except for one tremor. One single tremor when he saw how deep the rope had cut. His thumb twitched against her palm. Clara noticed. She said nothing. That afternoon, she told him she wanted to work. "Pay my debt," she said. "There is no debt." "Then let me help, because sitting still is going to kill me faster than these ropes did." Josiah studied her for a moment. Then he nodded. He gave her light work, sorting tools, measuring lumber with a chalk line, marking cuts. He showed her how to read the grain of a board, how to tap the wood, and listen for the hollow sound that meant rot inside. Then he handed her the hammer. "Grip it near the end, not the middle. You lose power choking up." She set a nail against a porch board and swung. The head glanced off, the nail bent sideways. She cursed, real cursing, the kind her mother would have slapped her for. Josiah said nothing. She pulled the bent nail, set a new one, swung again, bent it worse, cursed worse. Josiah still said nothing. 6 nails she bent. 6. Her wrist screamed with every swing, the rope burns splitting open under the bandages, and she cursed each one with language that would have cleared a saloon. She set the 7th nail, breathed, let the weight of the hammer do the work instead of muscling it, swung. The nail went in clean, half an inch of solid bite into pine. The vibration ran up her arm and into her chest. She stared at that nail longer than she needed to. 1 nail in 1 board. It should not have meant anything, but it did. It meant she had put something into the world that was not pain. Josiah watched her stare and understood without asking. "Better," he said. "Do not patronize me." "I am not." "That was a clean strike. Do it again." She did it again, and again. By midday, she had driven 11 nails, and her arms were shaking so badly she could barely lift the hammer. Her bandages were soaked through with pink. She did not stop until Josiah said her name. Once, firm. "Clara, sit down." She sat on the porch edge. He brought clean cloth and salve and knelt in front of her. He held his hand out, palm up, not reaching, waiting. She placed her wrist in his hand. While he wrapped the fresh bandage, Clara's mind was not on the pain. It was on the toolbox she had sorted that morning, on the folded paper she had found at the bottom, underneath a tangle of wire and a broken hinge. A printed handbill recruiting riders for enforcement in a western town, signed S. Whitmore, Elk Crossing. She had slid it into her pocket without a word. Now it sat against her hip like a coal, burning through the fabric. He knew Silas. He knew before he came here. She said nothing. Trust, barely sprouted, had frozen solid in her chest. That night she lay in the cot with Josiah's knife under the pillow. She listened to his breathing on the porch. Steady, slow. The breathing of a man who had learned to sleep light in places where sleeping deep could get you killed. Then, just before sleep pulled her under, she heard him speak. One word, slurred with dreaming. A name. Margaret. Clara lay still. She did not know who Margaret was. But she knew the sound of a name spoken by a man who could not let go of the person it belonged to. She had heard her father say her mother's name the same way, on the nights when the whiskey took him deep enough to forget he was supposed to have stopped caring. Something shifted in her chest. Not trust, not forgiveness, just recognition. This man was haunted too. Whether that made him safe or dangerous, she could not tell yet. Past midnight, Clara could not sleep. The cot felt wrong. Too soft after 6 hours of standing against a wagon wheel. Her body wanted hardness, wanted the ground, wanted something that matched the landscape inside her. She went outside, sat in the dirt beside the cabin wall, and without thinking about it, without deciding, she began unwrapping the bandages on her wrists, layer by layer, slow. She stared at the raw wounds underneath, the grooves where the rope had lived. Then her fingers began to pick at the edges, not deliberate, not calculated. Something underneath thought, something animal. Like she needed to see the damage to believe it was real. Like if she stopped touching the wounds, they might heal and she would forget what happened, and forgetting felt worse than bleeding. A sound from the porch. Josiah appeared around the corner of the cabin. He looked at her hands, at the unwound bandages, at the raw skin she was pressing her fingernails into. He did not say stop. He sat down beside her, not close enough to touch. He picked up the canteen, poured water over her hands, gentle, washing the dirt from the opened wounds. Then he wrapped them again. Clean cloth, careful knots. Which night has been the worst? All of them, Clara said. What about tonight? Clara looked at the sky. Stars. More stars than she had ever seen from town. The ridge was high enough that the sky felt close, like she could reach up and press her palm against it. I do not know yet. Then we sit here until you know. They sat. The wind moved through the meadow grass. Somewhere on the ridge, a coyote called, and another answered. Clara's breathing slowed. Her head tipped sideways against the cabin wall. She fell asleep in the dirt, and Josiah did not move until she did. She woke with the knife still in her hand and a decision in her head. She would stay long enough to learn the truth. And if the truth was ugly, she would be the one walking away this time, not the one dragged. Josiah knew the girl had the knife. He knew because it was not where he had left it on the saddle that morning, and because she looked at him differently now, the look of a person weighing trust against survival. He had seen that look before, in the mirror every morning for 3 years. He also knew she had found the handbill. He had seen her hand go to her pocket twice during breakfast, pressing the paper flat against her hip, the way a person touches a wound to check if it is still there. She had not mentioned it. He did not bring it up. This was his flaw, and he knew it. If he had to explain himself, it meant he needed her to believe him. And Josiah Kane had spent 3 years making sure he did not need anyone to believe anything about him. Self-isolation dressed up as independence. A foxhole with walls thick enough that nothing could get in, which also meant nothing could get out. Day 3 on the ridge. Clara was better with the hammer. Still bending nails, but fewer. 3 out of 10 instead of 6. Her wrists bled through the bandages by noon, and Josiah knelt to rewrap them. His thumb rested for 1 second on the inside of her wrist where her pulse beat fast and stubborn. He felt it against his skin, that tiny drumming. He pulled away before the moment could become something he would have to explain. While she drove nails, his mind drifted. It did that when his hands were busy with physical work. The body moved, and the mind slipped backward. Margaret had been sharp-tongued and impatient. She argued about everything. Which direction to hang the wash, whether cornbread needed sugar. She said it did not. She was wrong, and Josiah told her so. And she threw a wooden spoon at his head, and they both laughed until their ribs ached. She burned every 3rd batch of biscuits because she would get distracted by a book or a bird outside the window and forget the oven. She sang hymns off-key and did not care who heard. But Margaret had also threatened to leave. Once. During his worst stretch of drinking, 3 months after Samuel was born. She packed a bag and made it as far as the door. Samuel cried from the crib. She turned back. Josiah swore he would stop. He did not stop. The night she died. The fight was about Samuel's cough. A wet, rattling sound that had kept them both awake for 2 days. Margaret wanted Josiah to ride for the doctor. Josiah said it was just a cold. Babies get colds. She said he was being a fool. He said she was borrowing trouble. She said things she meant. He said things he did not mean, but that cut anyway, the way sharp words do when a man knows he is wrong and doubles down instead of admitting it. He rode to the saloon. 3 miles. Sat on a stool and ordered rye whiskey, and argued with the bartender about the price until the bartender told him to go home. 3 hours. That was how long he was gone. 3 hours. When he rode back at dawn, the cabin was wrong. The door was open. Margaret never left the door open at night, not with Samuel in the crib. Josiah found her on the bed, burning. Her skin was the color of ash, and her eyes were open but not seeing. She reached for the door, reached for him. Her lips moved around his name, but no sound came out. Samuel had stopped crying. Not because he was better, because he was too weak to cry. Margaret died that afternoon. Samuel lasted 2 more days. Josiah buried them both under the elm tree with his own hands because the neighbors would not come near the homestead. Typhus. They were afraid. And Josiah could not blame them for that, because the truth was worse than neighbors who stayed away. He had stayed away too. 3 miles and 3 hours of whiskey while his wife called his name. The axe slipped. Josiah caught himself before the blade hit his leg. He set it down. His hands were shaking, not from the work, from the memory. Behind him, Clara's hammer rang against nail. Steady now, finding the rhythm. She was learning fast, faster than he expected. Not because she was naturally skilled, but because she attacked each nail like it owed her something, and that kind of focus burned through mistakes quicker than talent ever could. She stopped hammering. "What did your wife die of?" The question came without preamble. Clara asked questions the way she drove nails, straight and without apology. "Typhus," Josiah said. "Were you there?" Silence, long enough for the wind to shift direction and a cloud to cross the sun. "No." 1 word. Clara did not ask more. She set another nail and drove it clean. That night she placed the knife on the table, not on the cot, not under the pillow. On the table where he could see it. Not trust, but something in the neighborhood of trust. Recognition, maybe. The understanding that he was carrying his own damage, and a man weighed down by his own ghosts is less likely to create new ones. Josiah taught her practical things. How to read wood grain. How to tap a board and listen for the dull thud that meant rot hiding inside. How to shave an edge with a plane until the wood was smooth enough to press your cheek against. How to mix mud and straw for chinking the gaps between logs, packing it tight so the winter wind could not find a way through. Western detail. Real detail. The smell of pine sap on hot days, sharp and clean. The ache of muscles learning new shapes. Sawdust catching the light like gold dust when you split a board along the grain. The way fresh-cut pine weeps sap from the end grain, sticky and sweet, and stains your hands amber. By end of day, 2 new porch boards were laid and nailed tight. Clara stood on them barefoot. They held her weight. She stood there longer than she needed to, feeling the sun warmed wood under her feet, feeling something solid that she had put into the world. Late in the afternoon, Josiah was splitting firewood when he stopped. Listened. The dogs that howled in the northern hills every evening had gone silent. Not the gradual quiet of animals settling in for the night. The sudden silence of animals that had been spooked by something on the trail. Josiah set the axe down. He moved the rifle from above the doorframe to the hook beside the front door. He did it without speaking, but Clara saw. Her eyes tracked the weapon and then tracked his face, reading the tension in his jaw. Then from the trail below the ridge came a sound. Not hoofbeats. Not a rider. Something worse. Something, the uneven, stumbling rhythm of someone moving on foot, too hurt to run and too scared to stop. The girl came out of the brush like a wounded animal. One eye swollen shut, the skin around it the color of a rotten plum. An arm hanging at her side at an angle that made Clara's stomach lurch. And bare feet leaving blood prints on the stones, each step a red stamp on gray rock. She could not have been older than 15. Clara was off the porch and through the gate before Josiah could move. She dropped to her knees beside the girl and reached for her, instinct overriding everything, the way you reach for a child who has fallen. The girl screamed, a ragged, tearing sound that sent birds scattering from the nearest pine. She shoved Clara's hands away and scrambled backward, her good arm flailing, her eyes wild with a terror that had nothing to do with Clara and everything to do with the last hands that had touched her. Clara stopped. She lowered herself to the ground, made herself small, held her hands where the girl could see them, palms up, fingers spread. It is me. It is me, Nettie. 2 minutes. That was how long it took. 2 minutes of Clara sitting in the dirt, speaking soft, repeating the girl's name before Nettie Barlow's wild eyes focused, and her breathing slowed from the ragged gasping of an animal to the shuddering intake of a child who has finally found something she recognizes. Clara, I am here. I am right here. Nettie let Clara touch her then. Let Clara gather her close. The girl was shaking so hard her teeth rattled, and she was cold despite the July heat, the bone-deep cold of a body in shock. Josiah knelt beside them. He spoke to Nettie the way he had spoken when reciting law to the sheriff. Calm, specific, no surprises. Your shoulder is hurt. I'm going to look at it. I will tell you exactly what I'm doing before I do it. You can tell me to stop, and I will stop. Nettie nodded once. A tiny motion. She did not look at him. Josiah examined the arm. His face stayed neutral, but Clara could see his jaw tighten. This is wrenched, he said. Not dislocated, but the muscles are badly torn. I need to stabilize it. I am going to put my hand here and press here. It will hurt for about 3 seconds. You can scream. Nobody is judging. Nettie braced. Josiah moved. Something shifted under his hands, and Nettie made one short, sharp sound. Then silence. Not the silence of pain gone, but the silence of a girl who had been trained to suffer without making noise. A girl who had learned that crying brought worse than what caused the crying. That silence was the most terrible sound Clara had ever heard. They brought her inside. Josiah gave up his chair. Clara gave up the cot. Water, bread, dried meat on the table. Nettie ate with her good hand, tears streaming down her face. Not from sadness, from the sheer animal relief of being fed without conditions, of putting food in her mouth without wondering what it would cost. The story came out in fragments, between bites, between silences that lasted too long and starts that came too sudden. Silas got Lyle Cooper drunk. Lyle told him everything. That Nettie had arranged for Clara to meet the Shoshone trader at the trading post. That Nettie was the reason Clara had a friend outside of Elk Crossing, someone Silas could not control. Silas went to Henrik Barlow's forge the next morning, told him his niece was the reason Clara had shamed the town. My uncle tied me to the barn post. Nettie said it flat, almost clinical. The voice of a child who has learned to report horror as fact because feeling it takes too much and there is nothing left. He grabbed my arm when I tried to pull away the first time. Something popped. She had dislocated her own thumb to slip the rope, pulled it sideways until the joint gave, then squeezed her hand through the loop. The thumb popped back when she fell. She ran before dawn. 12 miles in the dark, barefoot, following the creek bed that Clara had once mentioned in passing. Clara held the girl's hand through the telling, felt the bones in it, small and bird-fragile, and the swollen thumb joint that was still hot to the touch. Then Nettie said something that changed the shape of everything. I have been watching Silas for months. I know where he keeps his money, who he pays, how much. I stole his ledger, Clara, the book from the back room of the saloon. It has every name he owns. Clara went still. Where is it? Under a loose board in the church. Third pew from the back, left side. The ledger was not just financial records. It was the skeleton key to Silas Whitmore's entire operation, bribes to the sheriff, payments from the mining company to the reverend, contracts that turned free men into puppets with strings attached to Silas's fingers. But I did not read all of it, Nettie added. There were pages in the back I did not understand. Names and numbers from years ago. Clara filed that away. Pages from years ago. Something about those words sent a cold finger down her spine, though she could not have said why. Nettie was not finished. There was more. Clara, Silas does not just want you. He needs you. Your father's land. Your mother's land, really. It sits on the route the mining company needs for the rail's spur expansion. The parcel is worth thousands. Marriage to you gives Silas a legal claim to that land. You saying no was not just a rejection. It was a threat to a business deal. Clara sat back. The picture was bigger than a spurned proposal. Bigger than a woman tied to a wagon. This was a land grab dressed up as courtship. Nettie picked up the carved wooden horse from the shelf. She did not seem to realize she was doing it, just held it in her good hand, running her thumb over the smooth wood, the way a frightened child holds a toy for comfort. Across the room, Josiah watched her do it. Something crossed his face. Pain. Memory. He said nothing. That night, after Nettie slept, Clara pulled the handbill from her pocket. She held it up in the lamplight so Josiah could see it. I found this in your toolbox. You knew Silas before you came here. Josiah looked at the paper for a long time. Then he sat down at the table and told her the truth. All of it. I saw that handbill in a Cheyenne saloon. A man fitting Silas Whitmore's description was hiring riders, not lawmen. Enforcers. The kind of men who do what they are told and do not ask questions. I said no. Something about him rubbed wrong. The way he talked about the town like he owned it. Like the people in it were pieces on a board. But the name stuck, Josiah continued. Elk Crossing. When my homestead claim put me in the same territory, I told myself it was coincidence. It was not. I think part of me wanted to see what kind of town hires muscle. Maybe I was looking for trouble, because trouble gave me a reason to stop thinking about Margaret. Clara's voice was cold. So what am I? The right kind of trouble? Josiah met her eyes. At first? Maybe. Now? No. Now you are the first thing that makes me want to stay in one place instead of running to the next. Not romantic. Honest to the point where honesty becomes its own kind of wound. Clara did not forgive him that night. She did not send him away either. They sat on opposite sides of the porch, the dark between them thick with things unsaid, and listened to the summer insects and the wind moving through the grass. Clara lay in the cot that night, listening to his breathing through the wall, and thought maybe ugly truth is still better than a beautiful lie. Maybe. Josiah heard the horses before the sun cleared the ridge. He knew the way a soldier knows in the marrow before the mind catches up, that those hooves were not bringing anything friendly. 4 riders, moving through the creek bed below the trail, not bothering to be quiet, men who thought numbers made them brave. He stood from the porch where he had been sleeping across the doorway. His body was stiff with cold and the memory of 100 mornings waking in places where waking meant danger. He rolled his neck, picked up the axe. His hand shook. Not a tremor, a full visible shake that ran from his wrist to his elbow and set the axe head wobbling. He squeezed the handle until his knuckles went white and the shaking stopped. Control, not calm. There was a difference. He had not been in a real fight since the war, and the war had left things inside him that came alive in moments like this. The taste of metal on his tongue, the narrowing of vision, the terrible familiar readiness that was half terror and half something worse than terror, because part of him wanted what was coming, Clara. He spoke through the cabin door. "Wake, Nettie, stay inside." Clara was already up. He could hear her moving. She appeared at the window, her face tight, her bandaged hands pressed against the sill. 4 riders. Silas is in front. Josiah walked to the gate, planted himself, axe resting against his thigh. Silas Whitmore rode in first. He was younger than Josiah expected. 26, clean jaw, pressed clothes that had no business being that neat on a trail ride. His hat was new, his boots were new. Everything about him looked like a man playing dress-up as somebody who mattered. Behind him rode Lyle Cooper, thin as a fence post, eyes red from drink. Big Tom from the mill sat heavy on a draft horse, arms like tree trunks crossed over a barrel chest. And trailing behind, the Tucker brothers. Cole with his legs splinted and lashed to the stirrup because Silas did not accept excuses. And Emmett, barely 20, looking like he would rather be anywhere on God's earth than here. Silas pulled up 10 feet from the gate. He smiled. The kind of smile that never gets higher than the lips. "Morning. You must be the homesteader, Josiah Kane, Silas Whitmore. I believe you have something that belongs to my town. Nothing here belongs to your town." Silas leaned forward in the saddle. "The Dawson girl and the Barlow girl both ran from lawful community discipline. I am here to bring them back." Josiah did not move. He spoke in the flat, bored voice of a man reciting statute numbers. "Federal homestead land, Section 12. You have no authority here." Silas laughed, short and sharp. "Federal land. That is cute. You think a piece of paper from some office in Washington means anything out here? It means you are trespassing." Josiah paused. "And I know what the Territorial Assault Code says about armed men on federal property without a warrant." Silas dismounted, took his time, brushed dust from his coat, adjusted his hat. Everything deliberate, everything performed. He walked to within 3 feet of the gate and dropped his voice so only Josiah could hear. "Here is what is going to happen. You step aside. I collect what I came for. You keep your 40 acres. Everybody wins. Except the girl," Josiah said. Silas looked at him with something that was not anger. It was puzzlement. Genuine puzzlement. The expression of a man who truly cannot understand why anyone would refuse a reasonable offer. Clara does not know what she wants. Girls like her never do. She needs guidance. She needs you to leave her alone. The puzzlement vanished. Silas's jaw tightened. "Last chance, Kane." Number Silas stepped back and nodded at Big Tom. The big man dismounted and walked forward. He was 6.5 feet if he was an inch, and his hands were the size of dinner plates. "I do not want trouble with you, stranger." Big Tom said it and sounded like he meant it. "But Silas pays my wages and I have a family to feed." "Then think about your family. Because I am standing on my own land with an axe in my hand and the legal right to defend it. You come through this gate, you are not a man doing a job. You are a trespasser." Big Tom did not stop. He shoved the gate open. The latch snapped. They grappled, brief and ugly. Big Tom had 60 pounds on Josiah and 20 years of swinging a mill hammer. He caught Josiah by the shirt front and drove him backward. Josiah's boots skidded in the dirt. He hit the fence post with his shoulder blades and felt something light up along the old scar. His nose cracked against Big Tom's forehead, blood, warm and copper, filling his mouth. Big Tom could have finished it. He had Josiah pinned, one massive hand on his chest. But he stopped. Because from inside the cabin came a sound that changed everything. The click of a rifle being cocked. Clara appeared in the doorway. The long gun was in her bandaged hands. The barrel was pointed at Silas Whitmore's chest. And the barrel was shaking. Not movie-steady, not iron-willed, trembling visibly, the way a gun trembles in the hands of a person who has never pointed a weapon at another human being and is not certain she can pull the trigger, but is not certain she cannot either. Big Tom looked at that trembling barrel, and he understood something that Silas did not. A steady gun means a person is in control. A shaking gun means a person is terrified. And a terrified person with a rifle is more dangerous than a calm one, because terror does not negotiate. He let go of Josiah, stepped back. "Find yourself another man. This is not worth it." Emmett Tucker was next. He turned his horse without a word. But before he rode, he reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a coiled rope. The rope Silas had distributed to each rider for collecting the runaways. Emmett dropped it on the ground. The rope hit the dirt with a soft thud that sounded louder than a gunshot. Lyle Cooper went next. His hands were shaking as bad as the rifle barrel. "I'm sorry, Silas. I'm not dying over this." Cole Tucker followed his brother. Silas Whitmore stood alone in front of the broken gate. No men behind him, no leverage, no audience. Just a 26-year-old man dressed up like power, facing a homesteader with a bleeding nose and a girl with a shaking rifle, and discovering for the first time in his life that money and last names were not enough. He looked at Clara in the doorway. His voice went quiet, almost sad. I could have made you happy, Clara. I had it all planned out. Then his eyes moved to the cabin, to the porch, to the raw pine lumber stacked beside it. He noted the wood the way a man notes property. Nice pine, he said. Burns fast in summer. He mounted his horse. He rode away. He did not look back. Clara lowered the rifle. She could not hold it. The gun dropped onto the porch boards with a clatter. She did not faint, did not cry. She leaned over the railing and vomited into the dirt. Josiah sat down on the porch step because his knees would not hold him anymore. Blood dripped from his nose onto his shirt. His hands were still shaking. Not the axe-handle tremor from before. Something deeper. The whole-body vibration of a man who has just been closer to violence than he has been in years and is not sure whether the part of him that wanted it or the part that feared it is shaking harder. Nettie brought water. She served them in silence, moving between them with the practiced efficiency of a girl who has learned that serving keeps you invisible, and invisible keeps you safe. Clara watched her do it and felt something crack in her chest. Nettie was caretaking the way beaten children caretake, automatic, anticipating. The price of survival that looked like kindness but was really armor. That night, the dark settled over Broken Ridge like a wool blanket pressed too tight against the face. Josiah sat at one end of the porch. Clara sat at the other. The space between them was 10 feet and 100 years of things neither of them knew how to say. Josiah spoke first. Not looking at her. I was shaking. Clara stared at the dark tree line. I threw up. Silence. Next time we will still shake and still throw up. But we will still be standing there, Josiah said. Clara turned her head, looked at him across the porch. Two people sitting in the dark who were terrified and choosing to stay anyway. Still standing there, she said. 3 days of quiet followed. Clara let herself believe, for exactly 72 hours, that quiet meant safe. She should have known better. Quiet in Elk Crossing had never meant safe. It meant Silas Whitmore was planning. The plan was simple, which was exactly why Clara knew it would go wrong. They would ride down to Elk Crossing at night. Clara, Josiah, and Emmett Tucker, who had come up the ridge the day before with a saddle full of shame and a willingness to make it useful. Emmett had told them what was happening in town. Silas was spinning the story. Josiah kidnapped 2 women. Clara was dangerous, unhinged. The homestead was a den of wickedness. The usual lies in the usual mouths, and the usual town too afraid to question them. But Emmett had also brought other news. The widow Holstead had stood up in Silas's church meeting and called him a liar to his face. Tom Bridger had walked out. A handful of others were gathering at the widow's house, trying to figure out what was right and what to do about it. So there were cracks, small ones, the kind that water finds. Nettie would stay at the cabin with widow Holstead, who had arrived that afternoon with a mule, a basket of food, and the firm opinion that any town that ties women to wagons does not deserve to be called Christian. The ride down the ridge was silent. Night sounds, crickets, the creek running cold over stone. Clara's horse picked its way through the dark with the careful patience of an animal that trusted its feet more than its eyes. Elk Crossing after dark was not a ghost town. It was a town holding its breath. Lamps extinguished earlier than usual. No one sitting on porches. Even the saloon was half empty, which for a July Saturday was unheard of. Silas had created an atmosphere where gathering felt dangerous, where talking to the wrong person about the wrong thing could cost you a contract, a job, a winter's worth of food. Clara moved through alleys she had known her whole life, past the feed store where Silas had cornered her, past the dry goods store where her father had stood and watched her bleed, past her father's house. She stopped, one lamp burning in the kitchen window, a bottle silhouetted on the table. Clara stared at that bottle for 3 seconds, then kept moving. The church was unlocked. It was always unlocked. Reverend Whitmore believed a house of God should never be barred, which was convenient for a man who also believed God's house should serve as his son's base of operations. Clara slipped inside. The pews were dark shapes in the deeper dark. She moved by feel, counting rows. Third pew from the back, left side. She knelt, found the edge of the board with her fingertips. Pried it up. The space underneath was empty. Her stomach dropped. She reached deeper, scraping bare wood with her nails. Nothing, just dust and the dry smell of old pine. A match struck in the darkness. A candle flame bloomed in the front of the church. And sitting in the first pew, a leather-bound book in his lap, was a man Clara had known her entire life. Dr. Julian Hensley looked older than she had ever seen him. His white hair was uncombed. His eyes were deep-set and ringed with shadow. His hands, the hands that had delivered half the children in Elk Crossing, including Clara herself, rested on the ledger like they were holding down something that wanted to escape. "I took it 3 days ago," Doc said. "When Silas started tearing the church apart looking for it, I figured someone ought to get there first." Clara stood. "How did you know about it?" "Because I am in it." The candle flame threw his shadow long and crooked against the church wall. $5 a month. That was the price Silas paid me to refuse house calls to families he was disciplining. If a man stood up to Silas in town, suddenly the doctor was too busy to treat his wife's fever or his child's cough. $5 a month to look the other way. Doc's voice was flat. He was not confessing. He was reporting. The clinical detachment of a man who has examined his own wound and found it infected beyond treatment. I took the money for 2 months. Then I refused. Silas had my clinic wrecked, smashed the windows, broke the medicine cabinet. I told myself that refusing made me better than the ones who kept taking. It did not. I still took it twice. He held the ledger out. Clara took it. It was heavier than she expected. Leather cover, cracked at the spine. Pages dense with handwriting. Neat, careful. The penmanship of a man who understood that power lives in records. "Everything is in there," Doc said. "Every name, every dollar, every debt he holds over this town. Sheriff Redding, 15 a month. The forge contract for your uncle Nettie, conditional on cooperation. Reverend Whitmore, $800 from the Consolidated Mining Company for spiritual counsel, which is a fancy way of saying he preaches whatever Silas needs preached." Clara opened the ledger, tilted it toward the candlelight. Names and numbers swam in the yellow glow, pages of them. Months and years of corruption laid bare in the handwriting of a man who was so certain of his own power that he kept records of his crimes like a shopkeeper keeps inventory. She turned the pages, each one worse than the last. A map of a town being strangled from the inside. Then she reached the last page. The handwriting was different here. Same hand, but different ink. Older, as if this entry had been made separately, added to the back of the book as an afterthought, or as a record of something the writer wanted to remember but did not want found easily. One line. M. Dawson, settled. $50 to H. Barlow. Hardware root cellar modification. Clara read it twice, then a third time. The letters did not change. The meaning did not resolve into anything that made sense. Her mother's initial. Settled. $50 to the blacksmith. Root cellar. What does this mean? Doc Hensley closed his eyes. When he opened them, they were wet. "Your mother refused to sell the Dawson land to Reverend Whitmore. The mining company needed that parcel for the rail spur. Miriam was the legal title holder inherited from her father. Without her signature, the deal could not close." Clara's hands went still on the ledger. "She said no," Doc continued. 6 months later, she fell sick. "Do you remember? The cough that would not go away? She had pneumonia." Doc's voice dropped. "She had pneumonia because she spent 3 weeks locked in your root cellar in November. Edna Whitmore told her it was an herbal quarantine. Keep the sickness from spreading," she said. "Keep the family safe. Your mother trusted her. By the time I got to Miriam, the damage to her lungs was done. 3 weeks of cold, damp air, no warmth, no movement, and something Edna gave her, some mixture. I could not prove it then. I still cannot prove it now. But I watched your mother die over the next month, and I knew. God help me, I knew it was not fate. It was not pneumonia. It was them. The church went silent. Not the comfortable silence of an empty building, but the terrible silence of truth finally spoken in a place that was supposed to protect the innocent and had done nothing of the sort. Clara closed the ledger. Her hands were steady. Unnaturally steady. The kind of still that happens when the body goes into shock and the mind starts screaming so loud it overloads everything. And the result is a calm that looks like strength, but is really just the eye of a storm. "Henrik Barlow built the lock," she said. $50, Doc said, and he never asked what it was for. Or maybe he did ask and did not care about the answer. Clara pressed the ledger against her chest. The leather was warm from Doc's hands. Inside it, on the last page, the truth about her mother's death waited like a seed buried in poisoned ground. 4 years. 4 years of watching her father drink himself hollow. 4 years of believing Miriam Dawson was taken by God or by bad luck or by the cruelty of a world that did not care. And now this. Doc spoke again, quieter. "There is something else. Silas has written to the mining company claiming the homestead claim on Broken Ridge may be fraudulent. If they send a surveyor before you get to Cheyenne, Josiah loses the land. And without the land, there is no federal protection. Silas can ride up that ridge with 20 men, and nobody can say a legal word against it." Clara stood. She had to move. Sitting still with this truth inside her felt like holding a lit match in a closed fist. "Thank you, Doc. Do not thank me. I let your mother die and said nothing for 4 years. There is no thank you in the world that covers that debt." Clara left the church. She moved fast through the alley, the ledger pressed against her ribs, and nearly ran into a shadow leaning against the wall. Not Silas, not a writer, her father. Harlan Dawson stood in the dark with a bottle in his hand, swaying like a tree in a wind nobody else could feel. Drunk enough to lean, sober enough to have followed her from the ridge. "I know you are here," Harlan said. "Followed you down from the hill." Clara gripped the ledger. Her mind raced. He could turn her in. He could shout. He could do nothing, which was what he had been doing for 4 years. Harlan looked at her, looked at the bottle. Then he set the bottle on the ground. His hand shook as he released it, the way an addict's hand shakes when it lets go of the one thing it knows how to hold. "Go," he said. "I will head back to the saloon. Make some noise. Give you time to get clear." "Why?" "Because I cannot watch them tie you again. I cannot." Clara stared at him in the dark. His face was a ruin. Red eyes, hollow cheeks. The face of a man who had been dissolving for 4 years and had just enough left to recognize the shape of what he used to be. She went. She ran for the ridge trail. Behind her, she heard her father's voice lifting in the dark, singing, her mother's song, loud and off-key and desperate. A distraction for anyone who might have seen Clara in the alley, or a man's way of saying the only name that still mattered to him, Miriam's name, hidden inside the melody she used to hum while she sewed. Clara ran for the ridge with the ledger pressed against her chest, and behind her in the dark she heard her father singing, and she could not tell if it was the sound of a man saving his daughter or the sound of a man falling apart for the last time. Back in the alley, Harlan Dawson stopped singing. He looked at the bottle on the ground. His hand reached for it, fingers closed around the neck. Doc Hensley's horse came up the trail at first light. Saddle empty, reins dragging in the dirt. Josiah saw it from the porch where he had been sitting since midnight, axe across his knees, watching the trail for Clara's return. She had come back 2 hours before dawn with the ledger, and a face that told him something inside her had been rearranged. She had not explained. She had gone inside and sat at the table and opened the book and stared at the last page until the candle burned to nothing. Now this, an empty horse. Emmett Tucker rode out to look. He found Doc Hensley a mile down the trail, lying in the ditch beside the creek. Broken ribs, left eye swollen shut, and his left hand, the hand that held instruments, the hand that had stitched wounds and set bones and delivered babies for 30 years, had been stomped flat. The bones in 3 fingers were crushed. Lyle Cooper, following Silas's orders. A message written in an old man's broken hand. Help the Dawson girl, and this is what it costs. They brought Doc to the cabin. Josiah splinted the fingers with strips of wood and clean cloth. Doc did not make a sound during the setting, but his face went the color of wet ash, and his good hand gripped the edge of the cot hard enough to leave nail marks in the wood. "This is my fault," Clara said. She stood in the corner of the cabin, arms crossed, watching Josiah work. The ledger sat on the table behind her. "It is Silas Whitmore's fault," Josiah said without looking up. "I brought Doc into this. I went to that church, and now he is lying here with a crushed hand. Because he helped me." Josiah finished the last splint, stood, looked at her. "And you will carry that, because that is who you are. But carrying it does not make it yours. A man chose to beat an old doctor on a dark road. That man's name is Lyle Cooper, and the man who sent him is Silas Whitmore. You did not swing the boot. Do not pick up that guilt. You are carrying enough." By noon, the cost became clearer. Word spread through Elk Crossing that Doc had been beaten. 3 families who had been quietly sympathetic, the postmaster's wife, a farming couple from the South Road, a widow with 2 children, all sent word through Emmett that they could not come to Broken Ridge anymore. Could not risk it. Had children to feed and a winter to survive. And Silas Whitmore had just proved he was willing to draw blood. Clara wanted to rage, wanted to ride down to Elk Crossing and scream the truth into every face that turned away. Instead, she stood on the porch she had built and gripped the railing until her knuckles went white, and breathed until the rage banked itself into something colder and more useful. "Not everyone has to fight," she said to Josiah. "No. Some people choosing safety is the right choice. They have children. I know. I hate it. I know that too." In the afternoon, Josiah went behind the cabin. Clara heard the sound before she understood it. A dull, heavy impact. Flesh against wood. She came around the corner and found him hitting the wall. The same wall with the old dents. New dents now. His knuckles split and bleeding, the skin peeled back across the bones. He hit the wall again and again, each impact shaking the logs. Clara understood now. The dents she had seen that first day. Not old damage from a stranger. Fresh wounds laid over old ones. A man's way of turning grief into something his body could process when his mind could not. She did not tell him to stop. She stood and watched until his arm dropped and his forehead pressed against the wood, and his shoulders heaved with breaths that were almost sobs but not quite, because Josiah Kane did not know how to cry without feeling like he was drowning. Then he straightened, turned, saw her. "Lyle Cooper," he said, and it was not a name. It was a statement of intent. He picked up the axe, walked to the horse, started to mount. Clara did not move. She did not grab his arm or beg him to stay. She just said his name. "Josiah." He stopped, one foot in the stirrup, but in the axe in his hand, his eyes flat and far away, the eyes of a man who has gone somewhere inside himself where violence lives and violence makes sense. And the complicated, exhausting work of being a civilized person has been temporarily suspended. "Where are you going?" He did not answer. Emmett Tucker appeared from behind the stable where he had been stacking firewood. 20 years old, scared to his bones, but standing in the path of a man with dead eyes and an axe. "Clara left because she trusts you to keep this place standing. You ride down there and put that axe in Lyle Cooper. You lose the land, you lose the cabin, you lose her. Is that what you want?" Josiah sat on the horse. The war was pulling at him. Violence was familiar. Violence was simple. You found the man who hurt someone you cared about, and you made him pay in the currency he understood. No judges, no waiting, no trusting a system that had never protected anyone he loved. His jaw clenched so tight his teeth ached. His hands went white on the reins. The horse shifted under him, nervous from the tension of a body wound tight enough to snap. 2 minutes. 2 full minutes that felt like hours. Then he turned the horse and rode back to the hitching post. Dismounted. Set the axe against the fence. He did not look at Emmett or Clara. He went inside the cabin and sat at the table and put his bleeding hands flat on the wood and stared at them. Clara followed him in. She sat across the table. The ledger was between them. "Tell me," she said, "about the night Margaret died. The real story." Josiah told her. Not the shorthand version, all of it. The argument about Samuel's cough, the things he said that he did not mean, riding to the saloon in anger. 3 miles, 3 hours. The bartender telling him to go home and Josiah ordering another drink instead. The dawn ride back. The door open. Margaret burning with fever, reaching for the door, reaching for him. Samuel silent in the crib. Not sleeping. Just too weak. Margaret died that afternoon. Samuel held on for 2 more days. I buried them both under the elm tree with my own hands because the neighbors would not come near the homestead. They were afraid of the typhus. He paused. But that is the part I told people. The truth is I was not there. I was 3 miles away arguing about rye whiskey while my wife died, calling my name. Clara listened. Let the silence stretch. Do you want me to say it is okay? Because I will not. It is not okay. You were wrong. I know. Good. So what do you do with the wrong? Keep punching walls or start putting nails in them? Josiah looked at her. Really looked. And for the first time, he saw her not as a reflection of Margaret, not as a chance to atone, but as Clara Dawson. A 19-year-old girl sitting in a cabin she had helped build, asking him the hardest question anyone had ever asked him. What do you do with the wrong? Nails, he said. I put in nails. Then we ride to Cheyenne tomorrow. Nettie and me. We take the ledger, we take our testimony, and we put it in front of the territorial marshal. And your father? Clara's jaw tightened. She opened the ledger to the last page and pushed it across the table. Josiah read the entry. M. Dawson. Settled. $50 to H. Barlow. He read it again. Then he looked at Clara, and in his gray eyes she saw the understanding settle like sediment in still water. Your mother. She was murdered. Edna Whitmore. The root cellar. 3 weeks in November. Doc Hensley knew and said nothing for 4 years. Josiah closed the ledger. He did not speak for a long time. When he did, his voice was careful. Does your father know? No. And if I tell him, it might break whatever is left of him. He has been drinking for 4 years because he thought God took her. If he finds out it was the Whitmores, I do not know what he will do. What will you do? Clara pressed her palms flat against the table. I'm going to take this ledger to Cheyenne. I am going to put it in front of the territorial marshal. And I am going to let the law handle it, because if I handle it myself, I will burn that town to the ground. She paused. And I need my father in Cheyenne. His testimony matters. A man who was part of it, turning witness. That carries weight, a victim's statement does not. Emmett went to find Harlan. He came back 2 hours later with news that felt like a stone dropped in water. He found Harlan behind the saloon, passed out, the bottle from the alley empty beside him. He had drunk it. Of course he had drunk it. 4 years of drowning does not reverse itself in one night of good intentions. Emmett had dumped water on him, dragged him upright. Clara needs you in Cheyenne. You riding or not? Harlan, sick, shaking vomit on his shirt, eyes barely open. I'm not worth it. Probably not. Horse is ready. Harlan rode, still half drunk. He would sober on the trail painfully with the body's rebellion against the first honest decision it had been forced to make in years. Vomiting beside the road, shaking so badly he could barely hold the reins. But riding. The farewell between Clara and Josiah was not what either of them expected. No kiss, no declaration, no promises made with words. Josiah reached into the cabin and came back with a small revolver. Worn handle, clean mechanism. He held it out to Clara. This was Margaret's. She would want you to have it. You do not know what she would want. No. But I know she would have liked you. and I know she would want you safe." Clara took the gun. Their hands met over the grip, and neither pulled away. 3 seconds. The calluses on his palms rough against the rope scars on her wrists. A whole conversation in the press of skin. She put the revolver in her coat pocket and walked to the horse. "Josiah." "Yeah. Do not die while I am gone. I have not finished that porch." It was the closest thing to "I need you" that Clara Dawson had ever said to anyone alive. The fire started at 2 in the morning, when the air was dead still and the world held no wind to carry warning. Josiah woke to the smell before the light. Pine smoke. Not the clean, contained smoke of a cook stove or the distant haze of a campfire. This was thick and wrong. The sharp, resinous stench of green wood forced to burn, the kind of smoke that catches in the throat and sits there. He was off the porch in seconds, barefoot, the dirt cold under his feet. And then the heat hit him like a wall, because the stable was fully engulfed. Orange light threw shadows across the yard that danced and twisted like things alive. The flames had already eaten through the roof and were crawling down the walls, feeding on the dry pine boards with a sound like 100 hands clapping. The horse. Josiah's pack horse, the bay mare that had carried him from Missouri. The last living connection to his old life. She was screaming inside the stable, a sound no person who has heard a horse scream in fire ever forgets. He ran. Smoke hit him at the stable door like a fist. He could not see the stall. Found the mare by touch, her flanks slick with sweat and heaving. He cut the laid rope with the knife he kept on his belt. Pulled. The mare would not move. Her legs were locked, her body rigid with the paralysis of an animal whose every instinct has shorted out at once. "Move, please, move." The roof beam above them groaned. A deep structural sound that meant the weight-bearing timber had lost its fight with the fire. Emmett appeared, grabbed Josiah's arm, hauled him backward with a strength that should not have belonged to a 20-year-old who weighed 150 pounds soaking wet. The beam came down. The mare screamed once more, then went silent. Josiah landed in the dirt outside, coughing, his left arm on fire, not metaphor, actual flame, where a falling ember had caught his sleeve. He rolled. Emmett was on him, beating the fire out with a saddle blanket, and the pain arrived like a freight train, white hot from wrist to elbow. The stable collapsed. A fountain of sparks rose into the still night air and hung there suspended, like a constellation that had fallen to earth and was trying to find its way back. The cabin did not burn. The porch Clara had built stood untouched, separated from the stable by 20 feet of bare yard that the fire could not cross. Her nails were still in the wood, her board still level and true. But the fence was half gone, and the horse was dead. Josiah sat in the dirt beside the ruin, his arm blistered and raw, his lungs burning from the smoke, and in his hand, the only thing he had grabbed on his way out of the stable, snatched from the cabin shelf by instinct, before he ran for the fire. The small, carved wooden horse, Samuel's toy. Samuel's. He sat there holding a toy meant for a dead boy and watching another piece of his life turn to ash. He cried, not the way men cry in stories, with a single noble tear and a clenched jaw. He cried the way men cry when they are alone and have nothing left to perform for, ugly, silent, his whole body shaking with it. For Margaret, for Samuel, for the bay mare that had carried him faithfully for 3 years and died terrified and alone because he could not save her, for the idea that maybe this time he could keep something alive, and the proof that he could not. Emmett sat beside him, did not speak, did not try to comfort, just stayed. A 20-year-old kid sitting in the dirt next to a 32-year-old man who was falling apart and doing the only thing that mattered, being there. Morning came. Josiah stood. He looked at the ruin, looked at the cabin still standing, looked at the porch. He picked up a shovel and started clearing ash. Not because he was healed. Not because he had found peace or meaning or any of the things people talk about when they talk about surviving, Because clearing was the only thing he knew how to do when everything burned. You clear the ash, you find the ground underneath, you start again. The widow Holstead arrived when she saw the smoke from the valley. Behind her, Tom Bridger and two men from town Clara did not know. The widow looked at the burned stable, looked at Josiah's bandaged arm, looked at the porch still standing, and said the words that mattered. Silas burned a homestead in the night. That is the line this town does not cross. Nighttime arson. The coward's weapon. The act of a man who has run out of leverage and reached for destruction instead. And it had backfired. The people who might have stayed on the fence could not ignore fire. Fire did not discriminate. Fire did not negotiate. If Silas would burn a federal homestead, he would burn anything. By noon, 3 more families had sent word. They were coming, not to Broken Ridge, to the widow's house, to talk, to decide. The fire had accomplished what Clara's words and Josiah's law and Emmett's courage had not quite managed. It had made the cost of silence higher than the cost of speaking. Late in the afternoon, a rider appeared on the trail, not from town, from the east, from Cheyenne. The rider was young, hired for the run, and he carried a scrap of leather with 2 words written in charcoal. Warrant signed. Josiah read it, folded it, put it in his pocket next to the carved wooden horse. He picked up a hammer and started rebuilding the fence. Clara was signing papers in Cheyenne when she felt something. Not a sound, not a premonition, just a sudden tightness in her chest, as if the distance between them had weight and it was pressing against her ribs. She finished her signature, folded the documents into her saddlebag next to Margaret's revolver, and pointed her horse toward home. Because for the first time in her life, that word meant an actual place with actual walls and a man inside them who was waiting for her to come back. Clara saw the cabin from the top of the ridge, and the first thing she noticed was that the porch was still there. Her boards, her nails, standing between the charred skeleton of the fence on either side like a hand raised in the middle of ashes. She pulled the horse up and sat there for a moment looking. The stable was gone, a black scar on the ground where it had been. The fence was half rebuilt, new lumber bright against the old. And in the yard, a man with a bandaged arm was hammering one-handed, driving nails into posts with the slow, stubborn rhythm of someone who has decided that stopping is not available. Josiah looked up. Their eyes met across the clearing. Clara rode down. She dismounted, looked at him, looked at the burned ground where the stable had stood, looked at the bandage on his arm, the blisters visible at the edge of the cloth, looked at the fence he had been building alone. "You are hammering with one hand, slower than I would like." Clara walked to the lumber pile, picked up a hammer, felt the weight of it settle into her palm like a handshake from an old friend. "Use 2, then." They hammered side by side. No embrace, no tears, no words about what had happened while she was gone, or what she had seen from the ridge, or how the sight of that porch standing in the middle of ruin had hit her somewhere deeper than language could reach. Just the sound of 2 hammers and 2 people building together, which was the only language they had ever really needed. Nettie came running from the cabin. She did not hug Clara. She hugged Josiah, threw her arms around his waist and pressed her face against his chest, and held on with the desperate grip of a girl who had spent 3 days terrified that the only safe man she knew would be taken too. Josiah stood still for a moment. Then he put his good hand on the back of her head and held her there. Clara watched, and did not feel jealous or left out. She felt grateful. Grateful that Nettie could still reach for someone. That the forge and the barn post and the 12-mile walk in the dark had not killed the part of her that knew how to hold on. 5 days later, Marshal James Dunn rode into Elk Crossing with 4 deputies and a stack of territorial warrants. Clara rode with them. She wanted to be present. The town looked different from the back of a marshal's column, smaller. The buildings that had loomed so large in her memory were just wood and paint and dust. The square where she had bled was just dirt. The wagon was gone. Someone had moved it. Silas Whitmore was on his own front porch when the column arrived, dressed clean, hat on, boots polished. He had known they were coming. Of course he had. A man who kept a ledger of every debt and every secret in a town does not get surprised by the law. He gets dressed for it. The deputies dismounted. The marshal read the warrants. Conspiracy to commit assault, coercion, unlawful imprisonment, arson. Silas listened with his hands clasped in front of him, the posture of a man at church. When the reading was done, he spoke. "I would like a word with Miss Dawson." The marshal looked at Clara. She nodded. Silas looked at her. The mask held for a moment, the smooth, charming face that had convinced half a town he was their savior. Then it cracked, just at the edges. "You know, Clara, I truly believed I was offering you something good. The house I was building for us, it had a room for a nursery. I picked the wallpaper myself. Blue. Because I thought if we had a boy..." He stopped. "That is the whole problem, Silas. You saw a future for me. You never once asked me what I saw." Silas's voice cracked. For the first time, the only time. "Only because I was afraid of the answer." Clara looked at him. Really looked. Past the clean clothes and the new boots and the charm and the cruelty. And she saw for one moment the boy underneath. The child who was beaten with a leather strap by a father who called it righteousness. The child whose mother taught him that if you hold tight enough, people cannot leave. In another world, Clara thought. In a world where somebody taught him that love means open hands instead of closed fists, he might have been a different man. But this was not that world. And the girl he had tied to a wagon and the girl he had beaten through a proxy and the mother he had helped kill were all real, and they lived in this world, and their wounds did not close because the man who made them had once been a hurt child. The deputies cuffed him. Silas walked to the horse without bowing his head, controlling to the last the way he left. He would be tried and convicted and sentenced to 7 years in the Wyoming Territorial Prison at Laramie. Edna Whitmore went quietly. She held her wrists out to the deputy without a word. As she passed Clara, she stopped. "I thought I was protecting my son." "I know," Clara said. "That is the most frightening part." Edna received 3 years in the Territorial Prison. Henrik Barlow fought. He threw a hammer at a deputy and barricaded himself in the forge. They pulled him out after an hour, bleeding from a cut on his scalp where a deputy's rifle stock had connected. 5 years in the Territorial Prison, with additional charges pending related to Miriam Dawson. Sheriff Tom Redding did not wait to be asked. He walked out of his office, laid his badge on the desk, and sat down on the church steps. Last anyone saw that day, he was staring at his hands. He received a suspended sentence and a permanent ban from holding any office of public trust, in exchange for testimony against the Whitmores. After the arrests, Clara found her father. Harlan was sitting on the bench outside the general store, the bench where he used to sit with Miriam on summer evenings while Clara played in the dust at their feet. He was sober. 8 days now. His hands still shook. His face was the color of old paper. But he was sitting upright, and his eyes were clear. Clara sat beside him. She had the ledger in her hands. She had been carrying it since Cheyenne, where she had presented it to the marshal, and watched his face change as he read page after page. She had made her decision on the ride home. She would not protect her father from the truth. She would not decide for him what he could or could not bear. She had spent 19 years watching people decide things for other people, and she was done with it. She opened the ledger to the last page and placed it in his lap. "Read this." Harlan read it. His lips moved over the words. "M. Dawson, settled. $50 to H. Barlow, hardware, root cellar modification." He read it again. Clara told him what Doc Hensley had told her. The land deal, the refusal, the root cellar, the 3 weeks of November cold, the herbal remedy that was not a remedy, the pneumonia that was not an accident. Harlan's hands stopped shaking. They went absolutely still. Not the stillness of calm, but the stillness of a man whose entire internal architecture is collapsing and rebuilding at the same time. 4 years of grief being demolished and reconstructed around a new and terrible truth. 4 years, he said. His voice was quiet. Not broken. Something else. 4 years I drank because I thought God took her. I thought it was fate. And you cannot fight fate, so I just stopped. Stopped being a father. Stopped being a man. Stopped being anything except a body in a chair with a bottle. He looked at Clara. It was not fate. It was them. And I was too drunk to see it. Too drunk to protect her. Too drunk to protect you. Clara waited for him to crumble. Waited for the old Harlan to surface, the one who reached for the bottle when the world pressed too hard. Waited for 4 years of habit to swallow 4 minutes of truth. It did not happen. Something else did. Something Clara had not seen since the day before her mother's cough turned bad and the light went out of the Dawson house and never came back on. Harlan Dawson straightened his spine. His eyes cleared. Not with rage, though rage was there. Not with grief, though grief would never leave. With purpose. The aimless, formless sorrow that had been drowning him for 4 years suddenly had a shape and a name and a direction. And direction, Clara realized, was the opposite of drowning. I will testify, Harlan said, about Miriam, about everything. I will stand in that courtroom and say her name until every person in this territory knows what they did to her. Clara's eyes burned. She blinked hard and fast. 1 day at a time, Daddy. You still owe me today before you promise me tomorrow. I know. I will earn it. She did not hug him. She put her hand on his shoulder. One touch, brief, then she pulled away. That was all she could give right now, maybe more later. Maybe not. Both of them could live with that. 3 months later, autumn came to Broken Ridge. The second cabin was finished. Tom Bridger and Emmett Tucker had helped frame it. Doc Hensley, recovered but walking with a limp he would carry for the rest of his life, had set up a makeshift clinic in the side room. His left hand worked, mostly. The 3 crushed fingers had healed crooked and stiff, but he could still grip a stethoscope and still stitch a wound and still deliver a baby if one needed delivering. Good enough, he said. Good enough is good enough. Nettie ran the school. 15 years old and teaching grown women to read and write and sign their own names on documents that mattered. She kept a wooden box on the porch of the new cabin. Inside it, a note, a tin of salve, clean bandages. For the next one who comes running, she had told Clara. Clara did not argue, because she knew Nettie was right. There would be a next one. Harlan built fences. Slowly, carefully. 1 post at a time. Some mornings his hands shook too badly to hold a hammer. On those days he sat on the porch and whittled, because Josiah had told him that keeping hands busy keeps the mind from eating itself. 11 weeks without a drink. He did not count by weeks. He counted by mornings. Each morning a new decision. Each decision a small private war. Some days he won easy. Some days he won by the width of a hair. He had not lost yet. But he knew he might. And knowing he might was, strangely, what kept him fighting. Ruth arrived in September. A hollow-eyed woman carrying a baby in one arm and nothing else. She stood at the gate and said, "Is this the place?" The woman at the trading post told me about it, said a girl with rope scars built it. Clara opened the gate. She did not ask where Ruth came from or what had happened to her or who had put the bruise across her collarbone that was shaped like a man's hand. She just opened the gate and led her to the porch and gave her water and bread and a chair in the shade. The carved wooden horse sat on the shelf in the new cabin, beside Nettie's school books, beside a wildflower Harlan had put in a jar. 3 lives of loss, on one shelf, finally set down together. On an evening in October, with the aspens turning gold on the ridge and the air carrying the first bite of the winter to come, Clara sat on the finished porch, sanding a doorframe. Her hands always needed to be doing something. 4 months of building had turned her palms rough with calluses and stained her fingertips the amber of pine sap. The rope scars on her wrists had faded to thin white lines. Not gone, just healed. Like her. Josiah sat beside her, fixing a hinge. His burned arm had healed to a tight, shiny patch of new skin from wrist to elbow. He worked around it the way he worked around everything, steady and without complaint. Clara started humming. She did not realize she was doing it. A melody that lived in her body more than her memory. Something her mother used to hum while she sewed. A tune without words that Miriam would half sing and half breathe on summer evenings, while the lamp burned low and the needle moved through cloth. Josiah's hands stopped. He listened. The sound moved through the cabin like light through a window, filling spaces that had been dark for a long time. The last time he had heard a woman's voice making music in a cabin was Margaret, singing Samuel to sleep. Samuel, too. A lullaby that always ended with her pressing her lips to the baby's forehead and whispering words Josiah could never quite hear from the doorway where he stood watching, loving them both so much it felt like a fist in his chest. But this time, the memory did not cut. It warmed, like a coal that has stopped burning and started glowing. And Josiah knew in the quiet, certain way that real knowledge arrives, without fanfare, without lightning, just a settling, the way snow settles on a field, that he was ready. Clara noticed the silence. She stopped humming, looked at him. He was watching her with an expression she had never seen on his face. Open, unguarded. The stone wall behind his gray eyes finally lowered. "What?" she said. "Nothing. Hand me the chisel." "Which one?" "The one I like best." Clara paused, held his gaze across the doorframe they were building together, sawdust in their hair, calluses on their palms, the smell of pine and coffee, and the particular warmth of two people who have been in the same space long enough to learn each other's rhythms without trying. "That is not a chisel," she said. "No, it is not." She set down the sandpaper. He set down the hinge. Two tools placed aside because the work had shifted to something that did not require tools. "Took you long enough," Clara said. "I was waiting for you to be ready." "I am ready." "I know. I can tell by the way you asked for the chisel." She laughed. A real laugh. Full and free and startled out of her. The kind of laugh that comes from a place that used to hold nothing but pain, and has been, slowly, board by board and nail by nail, rebuilt into something that can hold joy. Josiah smiled, the first real smile she had ever seen on him. It changed his whole face, made him look younger, lighter, like the man he had been before grief carved him down to bone and purpose. A man who laughed at spoons thrown at his head and argued about cornbread, and watched his wife sing a baby to sleep, and felt the world was good. He reached across the doorframe and cupped her face in his rough hand. She leaned into it, not falling, choosing. And the difference was everything. "I am going to kiss you now," he said. "About time." He did. Gentle and brief. It tasted like sawdust and coffee and the promise of 100,000 ordinary days spent building something good. When they pulled apart, Nettie was standing in the yard with her arms crossed and a grin splitting her face. Finally. "Mind your business, Nettie Barlow. You are my business." Clara watched the girl walk away whistling and could not even pretend to be annoyed. Morning. The last morning of the story and the first morning of everything else. Clara stood on the porch. Below, the valley stretched toward Elk Crossing, the rooftops catching early light like dull coins scattered across the brown earth. The mountains beyond were dusted with the first snow of autumn, white against a sky so blue it hurt to look at. The sign Josiah had carved hung on the gate. She could read it from the porch. Broken Ridge Homestead. Gate is open. Nobody owned. Clara looked at her wrists. The scars had faded to thin white lines, maps of a journey she had not chosen, but had survived. She looked at her hands, calloused, strong, stained with pine pitch that would not wash out no matter how hard she scrubbed. 2 hands, 2 stories. The hands that were tied, and the hands that built. From inside the cabin, Nettie's voice teaching Ruth to spell her daughter's name. Letter by letter. Patient. The sound of a girl who had walked 12 miles in the dark and arrived somewhere that the dark could not follow. Down in the yard, Harlan stacking firewood with hands that were not shaking today. Slow and careful and upright, a man rebuilding himself the same way his daughter had rebuilt this homestead. One piece at a time, one morning at a time. And at the far end of the porch, Josiah, sitting with his coffee, eyes closed, face turned toward the sun. The carved wooden horse on the railing beside him where he had placed it that morning. Not on a shelf anymore. Not hidden. Out in the light. He looked, for the first time since Clara had known him, like a man who had finally stopped bracing for the next loss. Clara picked up the hammer, set a nail against new wood, drove it clean, one stroke, straight and true. She did not say still standing here, she did not need to. The sound of the hammer said it for her. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Every narrative is crafted to entertain, inspire, and empower our audience. We believe that great stories can change lives, and we are committed to bringing you content that matters. Thank you for being part of our community.